So this talk is understanding the helter-skelter world of building testable PHP applications. The after lunch slot on the second day is always a hit or miss one. Sometimes people are sick and almost conferenced out. Sometimes they're sleeping from eating food. But it sure beats being scheduled at 8 a.m. on the second day of the conference. So a little bit about myself. I've been working with PHP now, and I just was thinking about this morning, since 1997. I'm an old guy. I'm 42. I got actually quite a late start in programming. I didn't get my first programming job until my mid-20s. My background was civil engineering, so I actually can look at a road and say they've paved it wrong and the drainage is all wrong. So there's probably some testing lesson in there somewhere. I've worked on sites ranging from little simple personal blogs to large hook up with somebody to cheat on your wife while you're away on business, dating sites. So I've done a little bit of everything. These days I work for a company that's based out of Buffalo, New York. I'm Canadian. There's one other Canadian. There's Chris Bowden, our resident event-driven guy, and I think there's might be at least one more Canadian floating around here. I just want to say we don't all apologize. We're not all nice, and I will fucking cut you if you give me a hard time being Canadian. So, so my area of expertise that I've morphed into is on, surprisingly, testing. As you can see with my knuckle tats there, I want you all to test more when you're thinking about stuff. They were washable. I would have a hard time explaining to my kids why I have test more on my hands. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about testing, and so the goal in this talk is I want to get you into the frame of mind of what you need to do with your PHP code to get it into a testable thing, because it's far easier to deal with somebody like me who's reasonable at testing than dealing with good old Charlie Manson and his helter-skelter ways about dealing with problems. So the first time I got into the idea of testing was back in 2002 when I was working for a dating site. It was a death march for a year to build a site from scratch. I worked 120 hours in the 3 weeks leading up to Christmas, and my wife said if I ever did that again, I wouldn't have a wife anymore. So I was looking for ways to, I looked at what happened, and it was just a classic spaghetti PHP application. And I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be some strategies that I can use so that we don't, it was a pretty small company, there's like only 4 or 5 developers. So there's got to be something we can do and make this easier so that it's not always our users who are finding all the mistakes that we made instead of the developers. So one of our project managers had a copy of Kent Beck's Extreme Programming book in his office. So I started taking a look at it. And there was this section on testing, unit testing and automated testing. And I was like, oh, I'm not supposed to swear, right? All right, I'll keep it PG. So I looked at it and said, what the fuck is all this stuff? Sorry, Justin. I think this stuff could really help us, just simply because I kind of looked at this and I instinctively thought it would be way cheaper in terms of both money and time and personal sanity to find all the mistakes before our users did. So I got into unit testing. You got to remember, this is 2002, 2003, so there's no PHP unit. Or if it was, Sebastian there was no publicly available version of it. There certainly weren't any frameworks around at this point in time. There was one called Mojave that was basically a port of, for the really old school programmers, Java struts architecture over into PHP, so there was tons of XML, and as a result, I have no fear of XML. I've done tons of it. So I was kind of really on my own to try to figure out how to do some of this stuff, but luckily there was a framework, testing framework called Simple Test that was very similar to PHP Unit, but was in the browser. So we started writing some tests, and over time, anytime we started implementing some new functionality, we would write a test for it to try to get some decent code coverage. And so what I really learned, the first big lesson that I learned from all this stuff was that the purpose of tests is to save future you, and I tell my kids, because I have 2 little girls, one day I hope to be a brain in a jar and on the internet as a way to live forever, and I just keep asking them, make sure you turn my brain to face the sun so I stay nice and warm. So testing at its most basic level, I really think is about protecting the future you, so the you that maybe even tomorrow has to work on stuff from the current you. Because when the current you thinks they know everything, and really the current you knows nothing. It knows nothing of the future, and usually forgets the past because it's inconvenient and reminds you of your failures. So in many ways, tests are protecting you from yourself in many ways. Because this is when you get into testing mode, you start ending up like me. I have this theme of doing elephant stuff, so I have this awesome artist that does stuff for me. And so really, I spend a lot of time kind of sitting, I work from home, So I spent a lot of time sitting in my nice comfy chair in my office at home with my office manager, who's my cat, down there with me, cursing about code that's just not working in the way that we need it to, because we made a lot of assumptions and didn't write anything, and didn't think that this thing needed tests in the way that it did. So I'm trying to show you guys that we can make this. But testing itself, of course, is a huge topic. Multiple books have been written about it. I myself have written multiple books, and I'll be doing some shameless promotion of them at the end of the talk. But there are some basic things that I can show you guys within the span of this talk that should nudge you down towards the path. Because one of the realities is that some apps will actually resist our efforts to test them. We've all seen the code that's relying on, I know I was joking that people could come up to me and tell me about their horrible stories, and Justin shared one with me about a CMS where they were using global variables everywhere. Everything was in a global. So although I argue that people are just simply replacing global variables with service locators and dependency injection containers these days, so it's the same problem with a nice shiny wrapper around it. But there are some apps that are extremely difficult to test. The newer event-driven stuff is extremely difficult to test. Applications written in frameworks that have very little testing themselves to go with it are extremely difficult to deal with. And just sometimes you're relying on a lot of third-party API calls, and you're making calls to databases, and all that stuff is all intertwined at multiple levels down inside your code. That stuff is hard. It's hard to test. It can be done, but it will actively resist your efforts. So what can we do if we really want to start getting into the frame of mind that we need to test? Because let's be honest, it's 2014, okay, people? People, you should by now know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you need tests for your code. There's no longer an excuse. It's not like it was for me 12 goddamn years ago when there was nothing, and I taught myself how to do all this stuff. If I could teach it with my short attention span and my grumpy tendencies, all of you should get this down in about 6 weeks. So we can do this. We can make it happen. So, but there's two pillars we need to rest on. First of all, it's about having the right tools to enable you to not only write tests, but have testable code. So I'll talk a little bit about those tools. And it's also, the main thing that I've realized as I've done screencasts and other stuff, that it's about strategies, right? There's the epic thing. I will show you, bro, and it's going to be epic, because light bulbs really go on in your head when you start learning the proper strategies to approach when you have a piece of really janky code. Like I have an app that I'm using as a basis for a whole bunch of screencasts that's 12 years old, and it's still used every day by a bunch of my friends. And parts of it, I'm actually still afraid to go in and change because I worry, because there's no test, if I change something, the whole damn thing's not going to work. And then I instantly get, anytime I change anything, I instantly get a message from somebody that used it saying, you've changed something and it's no longer working. So I don't want you guys to feel that way, that anytime you go into an app, there's a fear. Everyone has worked on applications where there's comments around blocks like, do not change this, or I don't know how this works, or we just fired the guy who wrote this so nobody knows how to fix it. Those are all totally avoidable situations, okay? So let's talk about a little bit with some help from Samuel L. Jackson. What does testable code look like? If you're to look at a higher level of an application, what are some of the things that we're going to see in testable code? I think there's three general characteristics. We have single-purpose objects, meaning that every object, and of course I talk about object because we're a PHP. Okay, we don't do procedural stuff anymore, please, people. Again, we have objects. They may not be as great as in other languages, and there may be complicated stuff now like interfaces and traits and stuff that even I, after 15, 16 years, have never bothered to learn because I don't know, I'm lazy or stubborn or some combination of the two. But single purpose, right? Your objects, you're thinking very clearly about, I need to create something that's going to do one thing for me and one thing only. And you really have to resist the urge to do the God object, where it's one object that's doing all sorts of different things for your app, because that gets dangerous. You end up with really brittle code and one single point of failure, that you touch something in the God object and it's a cascade of mistakes happens and an error happens in some really weird corner of your application. So that's it. So the second one is loosely coupled things. And by loosely coupled, again, it means that you're not, I explained coupling a little bit, but it's the idea that you're hoping to, I think the ideal app is like Lego blocks. You're going to build an app, and we talk about, in some other programming languages, you talk about building objects through composition. You can kind of do that in PHP with building applications. You want to build things as, at lunch I was talking about this. You want to imagine building your app as Lego blocks. You want to put Lego blocks together. You don't want it to be like a 1,000-piece puzzle. where you can't just easily replace Lego pieces. They're puzzles, they're cut perfectly to fit, and if you lose a piece because your kid's not paying attention and throws one under the couch, then your app's never going to work properly. So loosely coupled meaning that you're trying to make things so that it's easy enough that if you need to change something, the whole thing's not going to fall over. And finally, the last thing is that I find is actually important too is consistency in your architectural decisions for your app. There's nothing worse than being able to look at source code and then identify when somebody's changed something. It's like, oh, I see as of this point, at this point in time, based on the commit logs, this person discovered design patterns. We see that sort of stuff all the time. So let's talk a little bit about the single responsibility principle, right? I found this slide, I thought this is awesome. This is a perfect example of what some people do. Just because you can do it, you shouldn't. So by trying to make single purpose objects, again, you end up, the functionality that you're after is a lot clearer because you'll get hints just based on the name. Now, I know sometimes you end up with verbose things like, hammer factory, factory, registry factory, right? Okay, that's like kind of like a joke about how you name things, but the name of the thing should really be a clue as to the single purpose that it exists for. I know I don't know how applicable it is to PHP because PHP is quite verbose, but in some other languages, people who are fervent believers in object-oriented are like an object shouldn't have any more than 5 methods, and it shouldn't take up more than on whatever editor you use. Because I'm a Vim guy, I'd flash the Vim gang symbol, but I have a drink. It should fit on the screen, and if you do single responsibility, if you follow that idea, you'll actually find, you do more often than not end up with that type of thing where you have all these little objects and you're slamming together like Lego bricks to make something. Because the reason you want simple stuff is because this is a quote that I attribute to myself now because I can't find the original source. The idea that simple systems can display complex behavior, but complex systems can only do simple things. Because the thing that I got it from, and I can't find the quote anymore, but someone did this really neat artificial intelligence experiment about simulating birds. And they're like, okay, we're going to create birds and we want to get them to fly together and flock together. So they gave them 3 simple rules. And the first rule is like, don't get too close to the other birds. The other one is try to fly generally in the same direction as everybody else is going. And the third one is pay attention when other birds are starting to cluster too close together. So kind of pay attention to where you are, pay attention where the other birds are, and try to go in the same direction. And then they found there was some really complex behavior that these simple artificial birds, they would create virtual environments for them to fly through and put all these weird obstacles in their way, and they were amazed at how close to how real birds would navigate around things. But it was like these 3 simple rules created some really complex behavior. And if they had tried to model a really complex bird, they probably couldn't have come up with a set of rules simple enough that the birds would all act consistently. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I actually found this kind of impressive. If you search for this thing, it's on Boids, B-O-I-D-S. The original paper's still there, but some of the other links to it are dead because I was looking for some of them before I gave the talk. So this is kind of like, keeping things simple. Sorry, the inversion stuff here, I'm a princess when it comes to atmosphere stuff, and it's bugging me here. So we talk about architecture stuff. I saw a post a while ago about the onion architecture of thinking your application as layers. And as a fan of the movie Shrek, there's an onion reference in there as well. Ogres are like onions, you peel away the layers. So, like I said, it's called the onion architecture, and its main principle is this: organize the layers of your application code like the layers of an onion. Every layer of the onion is only coupled or dependent upon the layer deeper in the onion. So it's the idea that the dependencies go inwards, they never go outwards. So if you think of the flow of a web app, of a request, all that stuff comes in and everything kind of passes things off. It comes in, if you're using a more modern framework, you're coming in through a front controller, and then the request gets passed in and then figures out what other thing is supposed to call, and everything just keeps getting passed through one way until the end, and then it comes out in a different direction, not through the same way that it came in. If you're a fan of reading up on architectures that people should know about but keep forgetting because they think they know everything, look up hexagonal architectures. Alistair Cockburn has done a ton of interesting work on explaining hexagonal architecture is also sometimes known as adapters and ports. I think it's a very effective architecture for an app where you're starting at a certain point, but you don't know where the thing's going to end up, and it provides you a lot of room a lot of room. The link there to this article is up there. My slides are up on Speaker Deck. I'll give you guys the link afterwards. But like I said before, a lot of these strategies are you want to build apps as Lego, right? You want to be able to slam things together like this little girl is doing. Because the unfortunate truth is that most PHP applications are like this, right? There's lots of spaghetti and there's lots of crying as people try to figure out what happened. Because you talk about being consistent in your architecture, this is a thing too that I've seen two variations on this quote, but the idea that inside every large application that someone has built is a smaller application that's struggling to get out. And what I mean is that you've probably created at the core of your thing a really good application that's solving the problem, but you've layered all this other stuff around it that you thought was going to be of use to you, but all it's really done is made things more complicated to you. Because I really, really believe in this idea. Your framework should be an implementation detail. Too many people, the framework becomes a giant killer squid that's strangling your app and making it incredibly difficult for you to do anything beyond really simple bug fixes. Imagine if the mandate where you work comes down that we're switching to service-oriented architecture and you have an all-encompassing full-stack framework. You're screwed. There will be no refactor. There'll be rewrites, and probably what will happen is that you'll get a little bit away into the rewrite and you'll realize how bad things are, that you have to split things apart, that probably if you let the fear bleed out and your manager finds out you're scared, they'll probably cancel the whole thing and you're still stuck with your non-service-oriented architecture thing, all right? But I know, I'm sure you're bored with me talking about more high-level things. I know I come to these things to be entertained as well. So let's actually start talking about some real specific things. So a concept that developers need to learn is the Law of Demeter. I took this quote from my favorite programming book of all time. I've worn out one copy of it, and my other copy is on the verge of losing pages as well. The Pragmatic Programmer by Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt. I highly recommend it. I refer to it every couple of months as a way to keep myself grounded and remind myself of the things as a professional, well-compensated programmer, the things I should be doing, not because I'm getting paid, but because it's what I'm supposed to be doing. So the Law of Demeter is really referring to tight coupling and dependencies. So the Law of Demeter basically says, if you have a method or an object that has a dependency on something else, rather than creating this dependency inside the object, you're passing it to it. So you can think of this, we probably know this as a more simpler name. It's also known as passing in a parameter. So you've probably been doing it for years without realizing that you were doing the fancily named thing that is dependency injection. I think I have a little example of this. Because I think it's like one of these things that so many of the computer science concepts, people are intimidated because someone has put a very long label onto something as a way, I don't know, they have to find something specific to talk about, or they're attempting to look way smarter than they really are, or they're jealous that other people are horning in on their actions, so they have to smart it up to make people be intimidated. But really, dependency injection is really nothing more than, and I'm not going to swear, passing stuff in to your objects. Because if you want to break down dependency injection, at its most simpler thing is pass objects and their methods, other objects that are required. So here's an example of some really horrible code. Okay, so we're doing some simple ACL stuff. So I have some code here. This is pretty basic. I've taken the liberty of namespacing it, so I'm keeping up with the times. So we have some code, and we have this access allowed. We're getting our request because we're doing some kind of janky model view controller thing. We get the request, we want the URI, we check on the session, and then in our controller, we instantiate our ACL object, and we say, are we allowed to get this thing? And if we are, since this is a credit card phishing site, we'll get access denied, or if everything's okay, now we can get all the stolen credit cards, so I can go buy myself a whole bunch of Magic the Gathering cards online and get them sent to my house, right? Okay, so this is very, I hate to say this, but this is actually very typical code, even today in 2014. So if we wanted to move this towards the idea of doing more loosely coupled code and using dependency injection, we can kind of do something like this, right? Where we're going to refactor our ACL object. And now, if you notice, we're using the constructor as a way to pass in the dependencies. So look at the previous one, right? We're creating something new inside. But now we're saying, no, we're going to pass you this thing now. Because now basically what we're trying to do, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to tell you how to create this new thing, instead we're saying, hey, I'm going to hand you something and tell you how to use it. So that you don't have to know how to create it, you just have to know how to use it. And the reason why this is important, I'll show you in a little bit. So this is one way, this is usually my preferred way of doing dependency injection. I like to pass all the dependencies in the constructor. Some other people like to do setter injection. So if you're, I guess, a refugee from Java and you like using your getters and setters, people like to do that too. So here's an example of if we were to refactor it and we wanted to use setters. And sometimes this approach is actually okay. If you're doing this kind of basic thing where you're just, I'm setting a value that I pass into something else. Sometimes you're using a setter where you have to do a little bit of work with the value that's been passed in, and hopefully you're not introducing too many side effects. And by side effects, I mean you're doing something, I guess the correct phrase is destructive, but you're updating something inside some other part of your application. So side effects are, if you're into functional programming, they're kind of like trying to minimize side effects in your code, that you're just doing one little thing, you're not doing something else at the same time. So we have setter. I know it looks really subtle. We just have the constructor and then we have the setter injection. But the reason why we care about doing dependency injection is because once we switch to using dependency injection, it means we can now start testing our code at the unit level, and then we can start using test doubles. I know in the PHP unit world, people refer to them as mocks. They're not really mocks. They're more like test doubles. In my book, my PHP Unit Cookbook, I have a whole chapter that deals with the different types of test doubles. But at its most basic level, what we're doing is that we're creating copies of the dependencies for the code that we're testing. And the reason that we do that is that when we're doing tests, we're trying to create scenarios. All my unit tests are scenarios where I'm trying to verify that one individual object is behaving a way that I expect. So in order to write a test like that, I need to be able to create the dependencies and put them in a specific known state. So I can say, if I have this object and it's going to call, and I'm going to pass it in, and then these two methods are going to get called, and I need to get certain results out of it, then I know that, I'm going to do some processing on some data, and I know I should get, 42 as the answer. So in my test, I would have to create some mocks of all my dependencies and all the things they're supposed to do so that I should be getting 42 as the answer. So when I run my test, it verifies it, okay? So really, test doubles, you absolutely 100% need them if you're going to do really effective unit testing. So what are some of the things that we create test doubles for? We create them for, most common thing is database connections. We can create test doubles of web services. We can even do test doubles of file operations. There's a really good, I don't think I have a slide on it in this presentation, but there's a really good virtual file system plugin that integrates with PHP Unit. So if you're doing any kind of code that relies on writing stuff to the file system, you can actually write those things in memory. So you can write tests for them without actually modifying the file system. And then other objects are test undercode needs. We need to be able to create a dependency. So what do I use for creating my test doubles? Well, you can use PHP Unit's built-in support. It's very verbose, and it does like about 95% of what you need for creating test doubles. Lately, I've started using Mockery, which is created by an Irish PHP pirate named Patrick O'Brady, who is, if you don't, how many people here are on Twitter, actually? I just have a quick question. Okay, about half, okay. I highly recommend finding Patrick O'Brady on Twitter. He is, to use the cool word, he is hella entertaining. And he's done a lot of really good stuff for PHP behind the scenes that I think most PHP developers do not know about. Mockery is one of those things. Mockery is just, it's a very, it's compatible with PHP Unit's own built-in test doubles, but I have found that it solves a whole bunch of problems that I could never solve correctly when trying to mock calls to things in PHP Unit. And then there's a new one that's out for people who are familiar with PHP Spec. I don't know how many people have heard of that. Constantine, who's Everzet on Twitter, and the folks who did BHAT. I don't know how many people have heard of BHAT, maybe a little bit for user acceptance testing. For PHP Spec, they realized that they would also need support for basically doing test doubles. So they've created Prophecy. I believe Constantine has told me that you can use Prophecy with PHP Unit, but I think it's still at kind of like an extreme alpha, use at your own risk type of stage. But for me, PHP Unit, built-in stuff, and Mockery is pretty good. So enough talk about stupid ways to mock things. Let's show some examples. So if you look at the bit of code that I've highlighted there, is that not showing up? Okay, there is supposed to be, I don't know, can you see it? Is there a, oh, okay, I just can't see it. There's a very faint circle around. If I wanted to write a test for that, well, how would I go about actually doing it, okay? So here's our test, right? It looks very verbose, which is why kind of mockery. If you care about how your code looks, use mockery. If you care about making it work, the built-in stuff is okay. But we're creating mocks for the code. In this case, we know that we're using dependency injection to pass in our request object and a user level for access purposes. So we mock our fake request thing. If we go back, I can kind of show you where we're at. Because you can see, just for this test, what we're using. We have this request object, a user level thing, and we know we need to use it, but we want to write a test, and we don't want to use the real request because we're doing a unit test. We're not doing an integration test where we need to spin up a copy of the app and do an actual HTTP request and stuff to it. We don't need to do that because we're doing unit tests. As an aside here, people need to understand there is a humongous difference between a unit test and an integration test. The unit test, all you're trying to prove is that one bit of code is working the way that you expect it. An integration test is making sure that two things, when they talk to each other, are doing the things that you're expecting. And then a functional test is you're trying to make sure everything is working the way that you're expecting. I focus on unit testing, and I used to argue, oh yeah, I'm sure people are shocked by this, but I used to argue with people on Twitter all the time about integration versus unit. Now I don't anymore. I say I do unit tests, and I don't worry about the integration ones. So we create our test doubles. We create a mock. We want a mock of the request. So now we're telling, incidentally, for people who want to know kind of how these mocks work internally, they use PHP's Reflection API to create a copy of the object, and then you modify, then you tell it further. What this step means is the first thing, the method will stuff, is you're saying, okay, within this mock object, this method, whenever this method call happens, it's going to return this value that I tell you to. This is so that we can create a scenario, a known scenario, and have everything in a known state when we run the test. And we do the same thing. And then basically we're just duplicating. We have a test user level, we have a fake request object, we pass it into the real thing, and because we've used dependency injection, the grumpy ACL thing doesn't even care that we're using a fake. Because it's like, you're just passing me something that looks like the thing I'm expecting, and I know how to use it. I don't even care that it's a pretend one, okay? So that's, if you want like one slide that shows you how to mock stuff, that's the one to look at. So one of the things we run into that's complicated in testing is because PHP offers protected and public methods. Protected and private methods. I tend to, they're difficult to test properly, to test directly, just simply because of permission levels. I know PHP Unit has some ways to get around those things. You can mock protected and private methods through a few contortions. One of the ways to do it is Etsy, who has done a ton of work in PHP on the testing side, creating an extension that you add into PHP Unit that allows you to set annotations. Who here has used Doctrine? Okay, and the annotations for this work the same way. PHP Unit will scan through the code with the extension attached to it, and it's not like a C extension or anything, it's just code, and it'll look for things that you flagged with certain annotations, and then it will do the same sort of trick that PHP Unit does internally, uses the Reflection API to temporarily, what it basically does is it temporarily turns the private or protected method into a public one so that it can be accessed. That's really, it's just a big cheat. And like, here's how Etsy does it, where we have some protected method, a private method that we want to be able to test directly for whatever reason. You just add an annotation to it, and then at runtime, it figures it out. You have to do a little bit of setup work in your test, which is why I kind of don't advocate directly testing your protected and private stuff. Then the test is very much the same. Another way you can do it is by using the PHP's own Reflection API, and that's what most of these like add-ons to allow you to test private and protected things do. They're just manipulating they're just putting a nice wrapper around the Reflection API. That's a link to a presentation from the Guelph PHP users group back home in Canada. That a guy wrote a really good blog post on how to test these things. And this is, again, here's like a sample I'm going to show you. Like, we have a thing that we want to do, and as of course I used to tell people, I'll cut you if you're not going to run any tests. But it's a protected method. We're actually scared to test it because I might notice them doing it. So if I was to do it with the Reflection API, As you can see, we have a whole bunch of kind of boilerplate we need to do. We have to tell, I want to reflect it, and then we have to set access levels. It's doing the same thing. It's just making a copy and allowing you to change the permissions so you can see it. But this is really the thing to remember. I never suggest directly testing them anymore. I tell them, make sure you test the public methods that are calling them, and then use code coverage reports for your tests to guide you on whether you've tested everything. Who here has actually ever written unit tests? Okay, that's a lot more than I thought. And if you install Xdebug, which is Derek Rethen's awesome debugging extension, and you put the right switch in at PHP Unit, it'll generate a coverage report, and it'll do a nice little HTML set of HTML pages, so you can go and look and actually look at every line of code that's covered by a test. And I tend to use that to in larger code bases to take a look and say, do we take into account all these conditional statements? Like every conditional, if you have some code that you're testing and there's a condition, an if in there, you have to make sure you have a test that covers if that condition is met or if that condition isn't met. And code coverage reports, I find, I don't get obsessed too much with the actual code coverage numbers. 100% code coverage is like incredibly difficult to do unless you've started the project from scratch. Where I work at Synacor, we have, I don't know, 20 or 30,000 tests, I think, and our code coverage is in the low 90s, and we're okay with that. We know there's a few edge cases, but our QA department is really good and usually catches all those things. So again, once you get into writing your tests and building testable things, keep going with the protected and private methods, because those totally make sense from an object-oriented perspective of you're trying to provide hints to the other developers that you should not be accessing these things directly, but test all the public methods. Don't worry about testing them. So let me get a drink here. And probably the most contentious thing that I run into about unit tests is everybody is pretty much doing something, and this could also apply to data stores as well. We can't limit ourselves to just databases. We have all sorts of NoSQL solutions where we're jamming stuff into data stores, key value stores, document, graph databases, column databases if you're really rich and have a problem that you want to solve that can be handled with column databases. So the first instinct a lot of people have is, I'm just going to create a database for testing purposes. No. Please, I'm here to tell you it's the wrong way. You're not doing a unit test anymore. You're straying away from the unit test into an integration test. And I said to somebody one time, if you're using a database in your unit test, you're simply testing that your database works. And the reality is that if your database isn't working for your production app, you're screwed anyway. So it's better. It's this constant struggle, right? With two opposite sides of when it comes to database stuff. You have the one side that wants to say, well, why can't I just use a database? It's so much easier than the contortions that you have to go through when you're mocking database calls, right? And I'm on the other side that's saying we're straying away from doing unit tests and we're going to integration tests, and then people are going to get lazy and they're going to cut corners. Because look at it this way. Think about what you have to do if you have a database. Imagine this too. So I'm assuming that a lot of people you have your production set up, and then you're going to have a staging server, right? So already a humongous pain in the ass to make sure that the staging server is updated with data on a regular basis. Because you should be doing that. You never want to be running tests against like super old stale data, because your users will always do something way different than what you expected. So not only do you have someone whose job now is to worry about, is the staging server have a recent enough snapshot of data? Now, you have some guy who's decided, I want to use a database for testing purposes. So now that's two databases in addition to the production one that people have to look after. And people are going to forget. And you're going to end up with, and people, again, I tell this all the time, developers, we get blind spots when we're testing our code. Sometimes when we write something, we know instinctively that we haven't done a good job and that the code's kind of brittle, and we may not be testing that code in the most efficient way. We may subconsciously just avoiding having to face the fact that we didn't know what we were doing when we wrote something. So database stuff, you get the same thing. People will write scripts to like generate fake data and stuff, but sometimes you really need the real stuff. So I think I have so many other things that I want to do other than maintaining a database, and I don't have enough power to just crack a whip at work and get some DevOps guy to work on this stuff all the time. And most people are having to do this sort of stuff themselves. So please, I implore you, don't use databases in your unit tests. Go through the effort to learn how to mock all the connections. Because here's like an example of how we can do this. This is very typical code. We're assuming that we've passed in through dependency injection a database handle, and we're doing something nice, and we're using something that lets us bind queries, so we're providing ourselves a little bit of protection from SQL injection. And it's SQL, not SQL, people. It's SQL. So we want to test it. So one way to do it would be, yes, I will create the fake database. and do that. But no, this is the way that I will do it almost every single time. I will actually mock and create a test double of the database, and I will do all the methods that I know are going to be executed. And then again, because I'm creating a fake thing, I've written my code in such a way that the code doesn't care that the thing you're passing it isn't real. It knows how to use it, and it's trusting you through passing in a dependency that's going to work. So you can just see, this is kind of the contortions they have to go to, but once you've done this a few times, you kind of grind your teeth a little bit and then cut and paste the setup from another test that you did. Or you create a helper function that will mock all these things for you, ready for you to use. Because what you're doing is you're testing your functionality. You're not testing that you can talk to the database, because again, you'll know instantly, unless you have really poor monitoring, you'll know instantly when your database isn't working. So this is kind of the setup that I would do, and then my test is very simple, right? All my test setup was done already, and now I'm just creating my new object, I'm passing it in my mocked up database connection, and the code runs. And this has the advantage of not incurring any overhead for database connections, network stuff. Test suites need to run fast. If your test suite takes like 20 minutes to run completely, how many times do you think you're going to run it, the whole test suite, before your deadline? I think that number actually approaches 0. That people will be extremely reluctant to run the entire test suite if it takes 20 minutes. If you're relying on actually speaking to databases, you'll run into this. Or real third-party, or as I'm going to show you, if you rely on talking to third-party APIs over the web, you want, every time you run your test suite, do you want every single call that refers to Facebook for authentication purposes to take 5 seconds? That adds up all the time you have to run your tests. Because API calls, your code is some yummy butter. I'm on paleo diet, but I still cheat and have butter once in a while. You want to wrap calls, API calls. And again, this is a very simple thing to do under tests, right? This is basically a design pattern of using wrappers for things that have to talk to real resources. So let's say we have a little hipster API where we're trying to find out about bands that we don't like anymore because they sold out. So we have our hipster API and we're making a call, right? But so because, even though I begrudgingly, because somebody told me on Hacker News I should be testing my code, all right, whatever, bro, I'll crush out some tests. So I decided to create a wrapper around it. And the wrapper takes the hipster API object as an argument in the constructor and then makes the call. So if I want to test this is super simple because I'm using the wrapper. Because the wrapper is doing all the work. I can then go and just pretend to create a fake bands that sold out call, right? I have some data that's going to get passed in. And then I mock my hipster API object and say when it makes this call that I'm expecting to make, return a bunch of test data, okay? So then I know for the test scenario what response I'm supposed to be getting back. And then sure enough, there's my test. I did all the setup. And then I'm executing the code. I'm basically cutting and pasting what I had in my controller. If we're looking at some sort of model view controller thing, I could literally take the code from my controller and slap it in there to simulate what I would be doing with it normally, and then I can just do my assertions, right? The idea of using a wrapper, it was, when I learned to use this technique for testing purposes, it was like a little miniature light bulb went on. I'm like, wow, I can think of so many other things that I was doing before that were super difficult, where I bent myself into a pretzel to make something work and was actually doing live API calls in my tests. Because another reason to not do these live calls and use wrappers is you could end up using a service that's rate limited, right? You're only allowed, I mean, how many people here have ever had access to a third-party web service where you can only do a certain number of calls a day, right? Yeah, see, it's actually pretty common. If you're doing test-driven development, do you want to waste all your calls on testing? I know my boss wouldn't be happy if I did something like that, or my handlers, as they call them at work. Yeah, because I don't have bosses, I have handlers. And also, you may also not have access to an API just in production, right? You may not have a sandbox. I mean, I know some of the nicer APIs will actually provide you. We have a sandbox, and we can give you an alternate API call so you can test things out. If you're using a wrapper, that's a perfect way to do it. You can create a version of your API just for testing purposes. So that's really super. I think that's a concept that a lot of people don't understand. That wrappers are even good if you're not doing testing. It's just more separation of concerns. So one of the other last things I'm going to talk about here is environmental concerns. And this is the tricky one that I think a lot of people don't initially consider. Your app shouldn't even care what environment it's running in. And when I talk about environment, I'm talking about development versus staging versus testing versus production. Because again, for some of the reasons that I talked about, you may have a different URL for a web service that you need to access when you're in production. You may use a different database. You may be using a smaller, like in-memory SQLite database in testing, and you may use the real thing in production. So your app, whereas it needs to be aware of the environment, large chunks of it don't need to. So one of the neater things that I saw is my boy Vance. Vance, are you here? Is Vance in my talk? No, he's not. Okay. Vance Lucas, he's the guy who did the bullet, the functional framework talk yesterday. He created this thing called php.env, which is a port of the Ruby environment helpers. And the idea is that you create a system, and this works really well with the modern PHP frameworks, maybe not so much with legacy stuff, where you have a bootstrap, and then within the bootstrap you find some way to tell the app what environment that you're in. So this lets you separate the thing for php.env, lets you set up a bunch of configuration options to say that if I tell you you're in development, use these database credentials. If I tell you you're in staging, use this other set. If you're in production, use this other set too. So that way you can get control over things like I talked about where you're wrapping API calls. You can eliminate a little bit of that stuff by saying, oh, I want you to pull out, I'll have like a large configuration object or a service locator or whatever sorry, I almost swore. Whatever the hell you want to call it. I should stop for 1 second. I swear all the time because I work from home. I've worked from home for 7 years. There's nobody there but my cat, and he doesn't understand English, so he doesn't understand when I swear. So I'm sorry if I swear. I know I probably should be a better example for my kids and not swear all the goddamn time. All right. So the idea is that, and you can even do this old school INI files as well, or configuration files, or you can store it as plain old PHP arrays. The idea is that you could separate these things out into 2 repos. You can have your application in one repo, and then your configuration values in another. And then depending on the environment that you're in, you push the appropriate repo to the spot. I one time worked with at a company, at a startup, that used this cool little deployment tool called Whiskey Disk. And it did this exact idea. It promoted the idea of your application is in one repo and your configuration things are in another. So that if you had to push a change that was just configuration, you push the configuration repo. So I like that separation, and I kind of try to do that. So we're almost at the end here, folks. So of course, the big thing that I always get asked is, how did I learn all this stuff? Because when I think about it, yes, it's been almost 12 years of working on this stuff, and sometimes I feel like it's never going to end. There will always be code to test. There will always be people that are in denial that they need to test. And despite my treating my Twitter account as performance art for the most part, because for those who follow me, they know I go over the top. I really don't act that way in my job because I would be unemployable. And I like having money, and I like doing interesting things. And I just couldn't do all those things if I really acted the way I am on Twitter. So people often ask me, how did I learn about all this stuff? Well, the sad truth is that for the most part, I'm self-taught, like most testing people are. Testing, I don't think, is really taught as part of computer science curriculum. You may do it at some point, but developers really, who here had mentors when they first started that actually showed them how to write unit tests? Yeah, like one lonely person, and power to you for finding somebody. Because it's extremely rare. So I had to teach myself. So what did I use to start knowing stuff? I've been on Twitter for an extremely long time, 2006, I think. So very, very early on. And I would just relentlessly bother people until they answered my questions for me. And I encourage you, I answer questions on Twitter all the time. So there's no such thing as a dumb question, there's only dumb answers. So I highly recommend, if you want to learn more, and even to get better as a developer, get onto Twitter and start following some people. You don't have to interact with them if you don't like them, but you can find out what they're talking about, because that always leads to interesting discussions. Yeah, that's something slip out there, right? IRC is not the domain of hackers who are stealing credit cards or trading in child pornography. IRC is a really good place to ask long-form questions. Because it used to be like Twitter's like for really short things. IRC is for slightly longer interactive conversations. Emails for when you want to ask somebody a huge number of questions and have them respond to you within a slower time frame. I highly recommend getting onto Freenode, where it's 100% free to get on there. There are a zillion different IRC channels for all sorts of different PHP projects. I tend to hang out in the PHP mentoring channel because I got involved in mentoring very early on, and 2 of my Jedi apprentices have actually gone on to actually really good both professional and speaking success as well. And that makes me proud because I really worked with them to get their testing skills and then help them out with the presentation stuff. I've been going to conferences for 10 years and I've been speaking at them for 8. So I have lots of experience with this, and I find that mentoring is an awesome, awesome way to give back. So some other stuff. So like I said, I've written some books. This is the first one, The Grumpy Programmer's Guide to Building Testable Applications. You can see the stunning resemblance in the artwork there. So that's at grumpytesting.com. Then my most recent book was Grumpy PHP Unit, where I sat down and I thought, what are people really having problems with? And people were telling me all the time they just didn't know how to use PHP Unit. So I spent some time and wrote a book, a little cookbook style thing of showing people, here's a set of common problems that you want to do, and there's some solutions. They're both ebooks. They're very reasonable. You can get the 2 of them for $40, and that lets me buy some more magic cards, so that's good. And recently, I've branched out into screencasts. If you go over to grumpylearning.com, I have some bundles of screencasts. And again, these things are actually kind of cool because they're not heavily edited, so you'll actually watch me from start to finish do something, and you'll hear my commentary, and you'll hear my thought process, and you'll see how I do research, and how I plan my tests, and how I do all that stuff. And I think that information is very, very valuable, especially when you're starting off with the testing stuff. You have no idea what to actually do. It's like, okay, I know I need to use PHP Unit. I know I need to do mocks, but I have no idea how to actually do them. So being able to watch somebody do it is good. There's some little free samples there for you can kind of see what I do. So that's it. We're at the end here. I thank you very much for your attention. You can find me on Twitter at Grumpy Programmer. You can email me at grumpylearning.com. Like I said, I'm on IRC and PHP mentoring. I would ask you to rate my talk, but I'm going to be brutally honest with you. This talk is almost dead. I'm giving it 2 more times. The last time I am ever giving this particular talk will be at Sunshine PHP, and I'm actually going to do a funeral for the talk when my talk is over. I'm going to delete every copy I have of it on my computer and get rid of it. Because this will be, when I give that talk in February, it will be the 15th time I've done this talk. That's enough. I don't want to talk about basics of testing anymore. You can find all those things online. I want to move on to more advanced topics like arguing with people about frameworks. So thanks very much for your attention. I'll be here to the bitter end. I'll be doing, I'm doing the closing talk. We talk a little bit about some of these things. There's a little bit of overlap, but I think it will be a much more entertaining talk. I hope you like this one. And I will be happy, just so people can get out of here and do stuff, I'll be happy to end the talk now. If you want to come up and talk to me, I am more than happy to talk to people. Please, 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 if you attend these conferences, do not ever feel like the speakers are special. No matter how special we think we are, we're really not. We're here because we want to be here. We're here because we want to share knowledge. If I didn't want to share, I wouldn't do these things. I highly enjoy coming out to conferences. I was very happy that Justin and the crew invited me to come speak. And yeah, you want to ask me questions about testing, anything related to it, I would be happy to answer them. So again, thank you very much.